Order. Can I get councillors, please, to come back to their seats? Otherwise, your lunch break will be used to go home and get your sleeping bags. We do want to get through this, but we want to be thorough in how we do it. And that includes the secretary.
What was that word you just used?
Curmudgeon. Okay, if I can ask Barry Potter and Ross Tucker to come through, please, to continue the presentation. At the end of this presentation, again, we'll have a section for questions before we come to the final area of the question of the parking, off-street parking. Barry, can I invite you to begin the presentation?
Thank you, Mayor Phil. I'll try not to skip slides this time. I did it already. Yeah, thank you. So this is some of this we've covered off in various workshops. So councillors will have heard some of this before, and we'll move through this a little quickly because Sean and Sir Brian already have covered off a chunk of this on their presentation. But when we became aware of different budgets, potential increases in cost, which goes back, as I think I mentioned last week, earlier in the week for those who were there, around 15th of March, because we were sitting in an office in Sydney. The sponsors, that was MOT, Treasury and myself, with the independent cost advisors, and became aware of the increased numbers. There were some things that we took a hold of as officers, which are really good prudence, good process. And the questions that we asked of CRLL were, are the updated cost projections reasonable? Are they what we've got confidence in? That was the first question. Are there ways that we could significantly reduce the cost of the project? And the third question was, given that those might be the numbers that we're going for, on the basis that we still had not received the P50 costs at that point from CRLL, is the project still good for money, good value for money? So the first one, I won't spend a lot of time on this if that's all right, Your Worship, because this was covered extensively by both Sir Brian and Sean, but and they talked about the independent cost exercise and how they went about assessing their revised estimates. I will mention though that one of the things that is associated with alliancing procurement is that there continues to be in that model, that contracting model, rigorous interrogation throughout the whole life of the project of the construction costs, and particularly the cost to complete. So that's an element. It's very strong in that alliancing form of contract, and those who have been involved in the America's Cup Wynyard Edge Alliance will see that happening where they're tracking well there. The second question is, are there ways to reduce costs? And this has been asked or alluded to already in some of the questioning. And first of all, under, again, the Alliance model of contract that is proposed for C3, is that the parties to that, all the parties to it, including the sponsors, end up receiving, through that, they're incentivised, everyone's incentivised to reduce costs because it has a pain share, gain share process in there. So kind of built into that contracting model is that incentivisation to always focus on cost. But the sponsors did ask CRLL to look specifically at significant opportunities to take chunks of money out. And it's been very busy over the last few weeks looking at this. There were 8 scenarios that were looked at in as much depth as we could, given the time frames that was available. So it is a fairly high level review. But those options included what would happen if we only did 1 tunnel, not 2. essentially made the network a one-way network. What would happen if we took out one of the stations? How does that impact on the project? And there was discussion and quite a look at Karangahape Road Station, for example. There was also a very good solid look at the option which Councillor Fletcher has mentioned, which is reworking the interconnection at around the Mount Eden end with the rest of the network. That's quite a complex and expensive piece of connection to construct. So those were looked at in some detail, both from a cost savings perspective, but also looking at the impact on patronage, on the operations of the network, on resilience of the network, what would happen if there was a train breakdown or a malfunction somewhere, how the whole network would operate. And what was found is that all those have quite a profound impact on the future of the network. They really do. This network, this model that's been adopted has already been looked at a number of times over the years, and the feeling is that the model that we now have, what's been allowed for in the cost estimates, is clearly the preferred model. If we did go for any of those cost reduction options, the impact of that is significant, because you've lost the ability to ever really retrofit them. If you decide, for example, that you go for a cheaper option at Mount Eden, that has quite some impact on travel times. It adds quite a lot of time onto the travel time out west compared to the current preferred model. Could add on there 15 to 17 minutes. These things are essentially irreversible, because to do that work for a start, we'd have to shut the network for a period of time, could be up to 3 years, 2 or 3 years. So essentially they are, once you've got it, that is it. You can't do a clip-on like we did on the Harbour Bridge. That option pretty much goes. The other part of it too is that the costs of doing those, not only is the inconvenience of shutting your network for a period of time, the cost is significantly more to do that work in the future than it is now. You'd have to re-establish all the construction to do that. You'd have to re-tender. It becomes a very expensive exercise. It's different to working above ground. When you're above ground and you've got a 6-car station, and somewhere in the future you need to extend it to a 9-car station, that's actually relatively straightforward to do. There's always inconvenience and so on and so forth. When you're working below ground, that becomes a major exercise. Now, the outcome of all those considerations, and as I say, Auckland Transport, KiwiRail, CityRail, and the sponsors, officers of the sponsors were involved in that process. The clear recommendation is that we proceed with the model as it currently is. And certainly neither Auckland Transport or KiwiRail recommend any of those as being really viable options. So a very thorough look was had at those. And this is the best option for the future to proceed with. The third of the questions is this project still good value for money? And the original business case was prepared back in 2015. CityRail engaged PwC to do an update of that business case and look specifically at the benefits. So they were looking at the value of the benefits, and this was a question that came up earlier, I recall, from Councillor Hills, as I recall. They readjusted the benefits based on patronage, which is running well ahead of forecast, and then projecting that out. They did this conservatively because there were some things they couldn't take into account. That's the impact of a 9-car future-proofing or a 9-car option as opposed to a 6-car option. That in the time frame available, that was not possible. But on their advice to us, the benefits for the project that is currently configured is $6.6 billion. So that means, and that was independently reviewed at Vizian, who are the sponsors' independent advisors, a well-experienced consultancy in this area, and they confirm that. That means that if the costs for this project are less than 6.6, then the benefits still outweigh the costs. And if you can do the maths there, which is pretty straightforward, benefits at 6.6 billion conservatively, costs at 4.4, that means this project still has, as it stands conservatively, a benefit cost ratio of 1.5. A good project to proceed with and well worth the investment is the recommendation. So those were the three questions that we addressed and hopefully have been able to respond to. We'd like to, Ross will then pick up the funding options, and we'll hold at the end of Ross's presentation and take questions that might be there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So the agenda item you have in front of you today is really fundamentally a budget update item. It's asking you to make some budget adjustments. The first recommendation A, is basically seeking your approval of making an extra $500 million funding commitment to the CityRail Link. So as you've heard this morning, the new reforecasted cost that's been through all of that rigorous analysis work is now $4.4 billion total as a total project cost. So it's a $1 billion increase in total project costs. The council's share is 50%. So recommendation A is looking for your approval to make that funding commitment of $2.2 billion to the CRL. So in effect, to commit to the $500 million increase. So the recommendation A asks you to provide that certainty, that commitment to CityRail Link so they can proceed with the project and continue with that momentum that you've heard is really important. And at the same time, we'll update our budgets to reflect that $500 million expenditure side. What's important is that as we commit to the expenditure, we also make some budget adjustments to offset that with some funding sources. So because that is a firm, effectively irreversible commitment to the spend, it's important that we make those budget changes on the funding side to give confidence and certainty to our investors, to credit rating agencies and other external stakeholders, that we do have a credible financial plan to fund that commitment along with all of the existing commitments we have in the budget while maintaining our commitment to the key financial strategy settings in our budgets, particularly keeping rates increases at 3.5% and keeping debt within our prudential debt limits. So that's our hard limit of 270% and our internal target of keeping debt to revenue at 265%. So there are 5 initiatives that are set out in the paper. They're up there on the screen. I'll go through those in a bit more detail. The paper makes it pretty clear that if we don't have a set of budget adjustments that amount to $500 million, then it means our financial projections will be higher than the 265% debt to revenue target. So we think it's very important that you think carefully about making those budget adjustments to give everyone that confidence. So the first 3 of those are really Treasury related. They're set out in the paper. We've covered these in workshops, but I'll just sort of quickly touch on them. So the first one is around interest cost savings. So this is a consequence of interest rates globally and in New Zealand in particular dropping over the last 12 months. So the market has changed. What we're doing is taking advantage of those lower rates, but also taking it a step further and locking in those lower rates. That means less cash spent on interest costs, and that provides about $120 million of extra cash we can invest in the CityRail Link. The next one is looking at a smarter way to manage our cash holdings. So Council currently holds $200 million cash to use for its day-to-day activities. We're looking to reduce that to $100 million of cash and also have a revolving credit facility, effectively an overdraft that we can call on to manage day-to-day cash. So because we have $100 million less cash that we need to have on hand, we can use that to repay debt and then in a couple of years down the track, we need the money for CRL, we can borrow $100 million more and stay within our debt limits. The third one is a bit of a technical item, but what it is, it's looking at the operating commitments, so hard financial commitments we have in some of our longer term contracts, particularly Auckland Transport's bus contracts, where we have a series of fixed financial commitments extending over the next 10, 12 years that effectively tie up debt headroom. We've had a good look at those contracts, and what we've found is just by getting a better forecast of those obligations, we're able to find an extra 130 million of debt headroom that without the need to actually change any contracts. There's no renegotiating bus contracts. It's just having a much better understanding of the magnitude of those fixed commitments. So those are the Treasury items. They are covered by Recommendation B on the agenda. Recommendation C is the one that relates to off-street parking assets. So what this recommendation does, is it is really it's seeking your approval to commence investigation on an off-street parking asset strategy. So it doesn't commit you to any decision about any transaction for any particular car park. It is purely asking you to approve the investigation work that Auckland Transport will do alongside council staff and other experts and key stakeholders to investigate, what are the future off-street parking requirements for Auckland, both within the city centre and also in terms of park and ride facilities. The intention is that work will pick up all of the things that have been talked about in terms of technology change, changing demands, growth projections in terms of residential and employment projections in the city centre. So the idea is to look at all of that in a very comprehensive way and then bring back a strategy, an asset strategy that puts forward some specific proposals and then proposed transactions, really focusing on the 4 city centre car park buildings. At this stage, nothing's ruled in or out. When these come back, they will look at all of the options, including the status quo of doing nothing, just keeping the existing arrangements, to outright sale of one or more of those buildings, partnership opportunities to work with a developer to do some development, build above them or redevelop the car park facilities in some way, or a long-term concession arrangement such as Sky City have recently done with their car parks. Everything, there is no commitments at this stage. All of this would come back to a governing body or an appropriate committee in due course. And at that point, you can decide whether you want to pursue any or all of those options. You also have, at that point, the opportunity to look at other options. If you don't want to pursue any of these opportunities, you can consider alternatives to find the $50 million that's required for CRL. But what is important is that we have a budget that balances, that we have a $50 million provision in our budget that shows we have a credible plan to find the money to fund the CRL. So we're asking you to make a $50 million budget assumption. So it is a high-level assumption. We know that the value of those car parks is significant. It's in the hundreds of millions. I guess we don't really know exactly what it's worth until we go and test the market, if that's what we end up doing. But we know it's in the hundreds of millions. So an assumption of 50 million is a very safe, conservative assumption. It could be as simple as one concession on one of the 4 car park buildings, maybe all that you need to do to achieve 50 million. So what we're asking you to do is approve a budget assumption for the moment, approve that we commence the work on the strategy. It'll come back and you make decisions and consider options in the future. And those options could well be you don't decide to do anything with the car park buildings and you, through a future annual plan or long-term plan, find 50 million a different way. All those options remain on the table. Okay, so the next resolution is Recommendation D, talks about central government. So specifically in terms of funding the CityRail Link, we're assuming there's $100 million that the council can put its share, the last $100 million of its funding into the project later. So the Crown would pay more upfront, council would pay more later. So just by being a bit flexible with the timing means that we can manage that debt impact in the back years where we have more debt headroom, more flexibility. So it's about working with the Crown to be flexible about the timing of when we pay. This would see us, still, the Crown and Council still committed to 50-50 funding shares, but it's just flexibility around the timing so that Council can stay within its debt policy limits. So the Resolution D as drafted covers that timing flexibility, but it also goes a bit further and makes it clear that we'll continue to work with central government on the full picture, so both in terms of timing and the quantum of funding. So we will look at both. And then just finally, this is a picture of the debt to revenue ratio. So you can see there we've got our firm debt limit, 270% debt to revenue is the red line. We have our internal ceiling, 265%, so it gives us a small safety buffer. If you were to agree to the $500 million additional commitment for CityRail with no mitigations, then the debt to revenue ratio would be that orange line. You'd see it, the debt to revenue limit ratio would crash through those limits. What we're saying, the recommendations in front of you give us $500 million of mitigations. It brings us back down to that purple line, and it would see us being able to accommodate that expenditure within that debt to revenue limit. So.
Thank you very much, Ross and Barry. Look, can I ask Shane Ellison and Mark Lang to come forward? We've actually started the debate with your presentation on car parks, but it may be that Mark and Shane want to add something to that or simply answer your questions. So, Mark or Shane, is there anything you want to add to what Ross has already outlined on the proposal? Maybe a little bit of a background on the off-street car parking strategy, which I understand goes back to council decision in 2015. I wasn't here, so I don't know much about it.
Thank you.
You weren't here either, but
thank you,
thank you,
Worship. Look, the only thing I'd like to say in as context is obviously we were approached a couple of months ago and flagged that to us and asked for our support with the potential cost increase with CRL. As from our perspective, when you look at the Regional Land Transport Plan, from looking through an AT perspective, even though the project is not being delivered through AT, we still see this as the most important project in the Regional Land Transport Plan. And so we were only too happy to support Council with trying to find options to fund any cost increase, rather than having to go to a situation which you were faced with, which was around rates. So we've been trying to support that process either through the cost engineering or the cost cutting exercise. We've been looking and supporting CRLL and Kiwi Rail through that, and Mark and his team have been supporting the finance team at Council with looking for other options which can support you and give you options. Ultimately, that's not a decision for us. They're your assets. They're not ours. Ultimately, we feel that that's a decision for you to consider going forward, and obviously we would support that over the coming 12 months if those resolutions were passed.
Thank you very much. Mark, anything you want to add to that?
Just simply that the parking strategy that was consulted on with the public back in 2015 did contemplate divestment of assets, but in quite, specific circumstances, but take into account a lot of the things that were discussed today about future usage, public transport trends, and what the optimal value of the usage of those sites would be.
Thank you. So we've got 4 people at the end of the table. So when you ask your question, if you can direct your question to whichever part of the discussion you think is appropriate. I've already got a long list of people here, so I'll start at the top. Councillor John Watson.
Mr Mayor, just 3 reasonably quick questions, and this goes to someone in Auckland Council. Throughout this process, the Audit Department, Auditor General, has been involved at various stages in terms of the robustness of the figure and the costs that have been getting thrown about for CRL. For example, back in 2014, going out prior to the long-term plan consultation, the figure was revised up slightly by comparison today to be more accurate. Later on, a group of councillors complained to the Auditor General about the vagueness of the cost and the potential for escalation. My question is, in light of that backdrop and the fact that consultation material has gone out with a figure half the cost of which we face today, how strong is our position in terms of having consulted in some degree of accuracy, given that backdrop that this has been signalled to the Auditor General over a number of occasions?
I might ask the Chief Executive to comment on that, John, if I can.
Yeah, through you, Mayor Goff. I think it's exactly the same answer that Sir Brian gave about the estimates now. Are they reliable? Can they be relied upon? And what was tested during the audits of our long-term plan and then our annual report through those years, and yes, there was a letter to the Auditor General about LTP assumptions on the CityRail Link, and they would say exactly the same that Sir Brian has said to you, and I would reinforce that. At the time, those assumptions were judged to be reasonable based on where the project was at in its life cycle and the fact that we, for example, did not have a completed design. So, those points are really important to reiterate, and I would expect the auditors will do, the same due diligence on our assumptions with the proposal to increase the CityRail Link budget for this council by 500 million.
In terms of the funding commitment timing, point 70 to 72 there, in any of this, has there been any thought given to council's ability to keep paying this 50% share in light of the probability of continued escalations? Has at any point anyone raised the issue of trying to renegotiate the actual agreement with the government?
I might address that because that was obviously one of the considerations I had when I saw what the impact on council was going to be. So I raised it with government ministers across much of the cabinet. Their response to me, I suppose I'd politely describe as forthright. Your council negotiated this deal with the last national government, and we're not going to revisit it. That was not the answer you or I would have wanted to hear. I made the case as to why, and I said it publicly, as to why I thought there was an unfairness in the deal, that any major transport network across New Zealand is generally funded at a far higher degree by central government, and particularly extending the length of the Kiwi rail line. I guess largely for financial reasons, if they are not compelled to negotiate that, because we have an existing contract in place, a heads of agreement that was signed up to by my predecessor and with the support of the overwhelming majority of this council, we are not in a position to unilaterally renegotiate that. However, there are other cost questions that come up with operating, etc., and I will continue to push the argument that far from the rest of the country subsidising Auckland, we're meeting more than our fair share because we're meeting 50% of the cost of a major part of our transport network. That decision was made under the last government. The members of parliament and the opposition party won't have a desire to renegotiate that, nor regrettably the members of the government and particularly the coalition partner in the government. So I hope that answers your question frankly and directly.
Yes, it certainly does, so we'll just keep paying. If we take a slight revision of that in terms of this request for changing the timing and delaying respective contributions, the figure of 100 million was mentioned there. Has there any thought been given to a request for a more substantial deferment in terms of the project cost as far as what the council's responsible for?
You happy to answer that? I mean, if I can go first and you can add in, because I don't know what might have happened at officials level. Again, I raised that quite strongly with the minister who's delegated to talk to me about it, which is the Minister of Transport. He said they will look at the case that we put up, but their expectation is that this council will do what they can on an equal basis and an equal timing basis, but he understood the debt to revenue ratio problem and promised that the government would respond flexibly and taking account of the challenges that we faced in that area. 100 million is the figure that officials have come up with, and that probably reflects your discussions, Ross, with Treasury officials, does it?
Yeah, so the 100 million is just an estimate. It's around some scenario modelling. The discussion we've had at an officials level is more around being flexible, as the Mayor's indicated, being flexible about the timing to work within the debt to revenue ratios. So it's kind of, so the direction I guess we've got is government is willing to work with us as needed and to the extent needed. So it's if it becomes necessary to fund the last part of it. So it's really been what is the number required as opposed to negotiating a particular number. I guess that work will continue after today in terms of working with central government.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Clow.
Ross, as Chair of Finance, I was aware that, because we've got 5 strings to our bow here, I was certainly aware that 1 and 2 were hovering in the background, and to a degree they were up our sleeve because for future scenarios of anything, but we knew it was going to be cost escalation of this project. So that's the issue of the interest cost saving, which the international markets are reflecting, and then of also the question of us being a little less conservative with our cash holdings. However, I will say, whilst I was aware, I was a little bit surprised that coming out so forcefully was the reassessment of the valuation of existing contracts. When did we start doing that work, or when did we start thinking, wait a minute, we've been too conservative and overestimating our liabilities and our balance sheet? That's my first question.
As we started working through with the Council Treasury team looking at different scenarios, one of the questions I raised from the telecom days was just how we were forward projecting off-balance sheet commitments. And typically what most organisations do is they actually assume that current operating lease commitments stay broadly flat into the future. It's normally a conservative way, which most organisations do. What was unique about our situation is we just put all these big PTOM contracts in place, and so they're at their maximum duration, and they would shorten from that moment. So there would never be, the obligation would never be that big again, because the contracts will start rolling on different maturity timeframes. So we did a very detailed review and piece of forward modelling on the PTOM contracts based on usage, which would feed back through into the council team, which has then been used for the forecast. Okay. So I guess to summarise, it was, I know it's a technical answer, but it was, we did a very detailed forecast at a granular level on the contracts.
So we were aware before, but we the first time we've really done the work to look at that, and I suppose the other question related to that is that we've got the dip there in the liabilities, and then they start coming up again, because presumably that is renegotiating and setting up of new piton contracts, is it?
That's as you start to lap some of the maturity of some of the existing contracts. If you extend it for the same duration, then your average life actually extends again. If you, say, had a 7-year contract, it extinguished to 0, and then you've renegotiated another 7 year, so that actually causes it to start to come up.
My second question, which has kind of been answered, but I just want to check, there is the question of the off-street parking strategy. So, because I think a number of councillors think that this has come out of the blue, and we've just come up with a new idea to somehow sell off some assets. So just confirmation that this is really something that has been discussed for a long time with the council. It's not a new strategy. It's effectively an old strategy where we're just starting to look at it. And could you also comment to reassure councillors that the question of this includes, we're allowing 50 million if we would go ahead with this, but it also allows 50 million for park and ride, whether it be on the Northern Busway or various other places.
Correct. So the parking strategy was, as we mentioned, publicly consulted on and approved back in 2015, and it does have specific paragraphs in there which we're happy to circulate that contemplated divestment. So it's the thought process, and I know a lot of work's been done in the background in the past with the likes of Ludo's teams looking at what could be done with the downtown assets. There's been thoughts around Victoria Street, and what are the optimal assets and usage going forward. So that conversation's always been there. It would be fair to say that there's been a burning platform here to have a quick look at it and to just reassess the viability of that. And we believe there is scope to do something. But again, consistent with the strategy, we don't want the cart before the horse, so to speak. We want the strategy work completed first.
So, Mayor, I would suggest that it doesn't need an amendment because it should be just a change. But in C, when we say agree to progress a strategy, I think A should be changed to the strategy because it was a prior strategy. This is not a new thing that we're developing. I'm suggesting that A should become the.
Yeah, I think, councils are like parliaments. Previous decision of a parliament doesn't bind the existing parliament, and the previous decision by a council doesn't bind the current council. I appreciate your point. This is not new. There is a strategy there. I wasn't part of it. I'm not aware of it. But I think councillors around the table would want, when they look at the options, all of the options, to be able to make a fresh decision on which of those options this governing body most wants to pursue. So I'm happy with the existing wording, but I hear the point that you're making.
Well, therefore, I really don't want a strategy to come back. I want several strategies to come back, and I don't want to be selling our car park buildings. I'll be quite open about that. But I'm totally up for selling the air rights above our car park buildings and being creative. So I don't want a strategy to come back, and I don't want that strategy to say that we're going to sell a building. That can be one of the strategies that comes back. So therefore, I just make that point. Words are important.
Sorry. Just to clarify that, the strategy is to assess the options. There will be a number of options. This body won't be faced with one option. They'll be faced with a number of options. And, like you, and I know Councillor Casey, I'd probably, if we can look at selling the concession, that may be the best option, but we need to look at all of the options. Sorry. Right.
No, it's just words are important because I have to confess I'm one of the people that in the original resolutions that came to the workshop where we had the word in there, implement, instead of investigate. And I apologise because I was one of the team that should have picked that up and not had that word in there, meaning the implement the selling of buildings. It should have been investigate, whatever the options are. So one word can be important.
No, absolutely. And just to make it very clear to everybody, the strategy is to investigate all of the options, and this body will make the decision on which of those options they want, notwithstanding what the 2015 strategy might have said. I hope that helps you, and I know Councillor Casey's raised that with me separately. Thank you. Councillor Casey, are you next on my list?
Nice segue, Mr Mayor. It's to Barry and Ross. This is the third time I've heard this presentation, and I still have a problem with C1. And what my question to you is, given that, and I know the first workshop and the second workshop, I have heard nobody speak in favour of selling. Not one single elected member at any workshop, and presumably not today either. Why is it still in there? Isn't a workshop to get direction? To get direction from elected members, and that being the case, why is it you've brought back the same set of recommendations that came to the last workshop, when you were very clearly directed that this shouldn't be an option on the table? And if it's still in there, I'm going to ask for it to be removed. But that's my question to you. Were you listening?
To be fair, I'm just jumping in here, they were listening, and what was originally put up as a draft proposal is quite different from this proposal. This is about investigating, it's not about implementing. So when you investigate, you look at all options. Otherwise, your investigation's only a partial one, and then you have the ability to choose which of those options, based on the work done, you prefer, and I know exactly what your preferred option is, Councillor. Can I ask the Chief Executive just to comment on this too, please?
Just very briefly, Mayor Goff, we also were asked to remove the weasel words and be crystal clear that if we were going to look at selling, we would say selling. So we've actually done what a number of elected members wanted us to do, which was to be clear about all of the options and what they mean. So we dropped capital recycling, and divestment and other words disappeared.
Thank you for making it clear, but the words outright sale are still in there, and I have heard. I've been listening really carefully. What is the reason for keeping it on the table when it's patently not wanted? We don't want to sell our parking buildings. They make us revenue. Unless somebody else has got an alternative that I haven't heard yet, but I think I've heard from all my colleagues. So why would you still put it in there? Just take it out, and you might actually get some unanimity today. So I'm looking at you, but it's actually to the Mayor.
I think that's directed at me. Because when you do an investigation of all of the options, you know that you've got everything on the table. It's a smorgasbord, and this body, then chooses on the basis of all of the facts that come out of that investigation, which of those options we want. If you take an option off beforehand, you'll always be challenged on, well, you didn't look at all the options. Now, it's up to us to decide which option we prefer. And I think I've got an idea that, probably if we sell a concession, that would be the favoured option. But I want to know, and I think others would want to know, all of the information so that we are making a genuine choice, even of an investigation of something that we may end up rejecting. But if you reject it before you investigate it, it looks very much like predetermination, and you haven't looked at all the options. I'd rather look at all the options and make a decision based on the facts and the material that comes out of it, than have something hanging in the air but you never looked at that. That might have been a better deal for the ratepayer. It might or it might not have. We won't know unless we investigate it.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Well, we'll test that through an amendment to remove the words outright sale. The other one that still hasn't changed is, I think, as you've just said, the decision should be made by the governing body, but the C3 still says all the appropriate.
I'm happy to accept that amendment. It should come back here.
Thank you.
Councillor Penny-Hulse.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just a couple of questions. Trying to kind of get right back up to the top of this group of options that we're looking at. I think I'm directing it to our Treasury team. So the test of reasonableness, which I think we've gone through, is the set of assumptions reasonable? And I think that the test of reasonableness has been well proven, and I would imagine that the audit process will. That's what they'll be looking at. Have we been robust in everything that we've tested? So as part of that set of presumptions and the smorgasbord of options that we've come up with to provide the 500 million, this is the heart of my question. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of those things will happen, but we need to prove, I guess I'm presuming most of them will, but we need to prove that we've got the wherewithal to deal with the final P50 sum as it's been put to us, and this is the series of options that we've got. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. We need to have a credible financial plan that is supported by good data, evidence, and has realistic, credible assumptions. We think this does that, and by putting this plan in place, it demonstrates that we've got a good budget that works, that stays within our debt to revenue limits. That's not to say we'll fully implement the plan and the budget exactly as it is there. Things always change and evolve over time. Every annual plan, we look at budgets and things can change and move through normal budget processes.
I think it's just, important for us to actually hold the reality of how these processes work. And council sets budgets, we set 10-year plans, and then changes happen as the world changes around us. And I think this is part of doing that. We're trying to project and understand quite clearly how that world's changing and account for it. So my second question follows on a little bit from Councillor Clo's very good question around the reassessment of valuation of operating commitments. So I'm kind of intrigued, and I think we're sort of asking the same question, but I need to just understand a little bit more. We feel that as we go into our budgets, we've squeezed and shaken every jam jar that we possibly could shake and squeeze. Is this a jam jar that has not necessarily been fully investigated, or is it a new jam jar?
I guess it's a jam jar we've had a much closer look at. It is a $500 million jam jar that it chews up a lot of our debt capacity, so it's an obvious target for us to have a close look at when something like this comes up. I guess when we first looked at it, we looked at all the options, and which could have led towards relooking at bus contracts and things that are much more fundamental. What we've ended up with is just by having a much better understanding of the forward projections, we'll be able to find this extra capacity.
Fantastic. I think it's a very good piece of work, and I think as we go forward, Mr Mayor, there may be some other reassessments of valuation of operating commitments that we could look at in other parts of our business. The last question is just looking at how the package has been put together. Does the package need to relate to transport orientated business of council and our CCO, or is the package able to include other operations of council?
It needs to provide, the package needs to provide enough cash to pay for the CRL. It can come from whatever area we want to look at. This is a package, a set of budget assumptions that can be agreed now, but as we've said, that can be reviewed through future annual budget and long-term plan processes, and the funds could come from anywhere that provides, any source that provides the revenue that we need.
That's really useful, thank you, and I hope by holding that larger picture we don't go down foxholes and minutiae that are somewhat irrelevant to the current discussion that we're having. Thank you, and I reserve my right to speak in the debate.
Thank you very much. Councillor Newman.
Thank you. Ross, what other shots are in our locker in the event that we face a number that blows out beyond the P50 figure?
Well, if a number comes in, if a revised cost estimate comes in that's beyond the P50 figure in due course, then we have all the range of things that we normally look at through a 10-year budget and through a financial strategy, which goes to how can we increase revenue, how can we reduce costs, how can we look at what assets we hold, our investment in terms of the timing and extent of the capital program. So there's all those things that can be considered in the fullness of time with more time through consultation processes through the next 10-year budget process. There will be 2 more LTP processes that come and go before the CRL becomes operational. So you have the benefit of time there. Also, with a bit more time, then we can look at more alternative financing opportunities, things like greater use of SPVs and some more other strategic alternative financing arrangements. Some of that may require legislative change, may take 2 or 3 years of lead time. So we have time on our side to deal with those other cost estimates in the future.
Okay, I've got a couple of other questions, but your starting position today is this reflects your best advice for how we get over the line on this one. So could you please give me the 2017-2018 EBITDA result for the 4 car parks?
So which year were you after?
17-18, the EBITDA results for the 4 car parks by car park.
I've got here in front of me, it's probably best to actually just give you the revenue numbers, then I can give you the total earnings for the 4 if that's. So out of the 4 big car parks, the revenue for the last financial year was 23.8 million. A big chunk or portion of that sits inside downtown, which is 10.4. Yeah, we can distribute this afterwards if it would make it more. Okay. 6.7 for Civic. Victoria was 5.2 and Fanshawe 1.6. If you then, so I know I went through that quite quickly, but we can provide it afterwards. If you take the net operating or EBITDA margin excluding depreciation, it's approximately 20 million versus the 23.8 of revenue. And if you then take a number including depreciation, it's 15.4 million.
Okay, so that 15.4 million, that's the final EBITDA for 17-18 for the 4 car park.
Sorry, no, that includes depreciation, so it's
Okay.
EBITDA, so that's sort of, think of it as net surplus.
Right, okay. Do you have the cumulative number over, say, 5 years?
Well, we could base, it's been growing within that. I haven't got it added up in front of me, but there has been growth within that 5 years. But if you effectively took that times 5, about 80% of the numbers, probably 90% of the.
In terms of strategy, is the reason why the information that drives the assumptions in this paper and the costings of it was not set out in the draft annual plan was a desire not to send price signals to the market?
Well, I guess more fundamentally, the numbers were not available at that point. We had the new cost estimates for the CRL on the 12th of April, so just a few weeks ago. We didn't have any cost. We did not have the reforecast cost information at the time we set our draft annual plan.
I don't have the draft annual plan in front of me. Is there any reference, or what were the words that were used in the consultation around that potential that we face around a significant cost overrun that's going to have to be made up now? We didn't consult on it, but did we include any words?
We didn't consult on that. I guess the messaging in the consultation document was very brief. It talked about we would review and refresh all of our budgets, that the budgets would be primarily based off year 2 of the 10-year budget that was approved, and it would go through a normal process of reviewing and refreshing all costs.
My final question, and I do reserve the right to speak, relates to the issue of the previous consultation on the car parking strategy. I don't have the document in front of me. Did that years old strategy that has been subject to consultation tie the option of potential divestment of the car parks to the need to get cash in order to help fund projects such as this?
There's no explicit wording of things of that nature. Again, we can share the wording afterwards. It contemplated a range of options, such as are they in the best location? How does it relate to the sort of things that Beat was talking to earlier about, utilisation within the city? Is there a higher alternate use? So possibly, that it could fall into that. But I guess the key point, as was raised before, is while there's an existing strategy, we would do the work and bring back a recommendation or the options for councillors to consider.
One final question, with your indulgence, Your Worship. Reflecting back on what Viv Beck talked about this morning, do you have readily available information to inform the council about the inner city off-street car parking market the level of competition or lack thereof, and the role of council in helping to ensure that there is sufficient competition to drive price so that consumers are winners? And is that information available for us?
I don't have a specific report that's packaged up, but I would envisage as part of this work we'd pull that together. There's obviously lots of anecdotal things around the relative pricing of daily rates, etc., but it's hard to understand to the extent that you shift pricing in the market, to what extent other players move in the market or not.
Are there any other major players other than Wilson's in tournament?
Not that I'm aware of.
There will be another player, the one that's just bought Sky City.
Macquarie.
I think there are other. I mean, I don't know who's running precinct properties. They're developing more car park spaces, but all of that would come out in the investigation. They're all valid questions. But once we've got all that information, we'll know the answers to some of the questions that councillors validly are holding at the moment. Right. Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Your Worship. I've got a number of questions, but I guess where I want to direct them is probably from a financial perspective. Councillor Simpson was quite correct in her questions to Sir Brian around, I suppose, the public confidence in this. We all, I think, agree this is the most important project before council at the moment. If we are to have our Waterloo, then have we done everything? Have officers advised us as diligently as they might on all of the costs, so that if we're going to actually have disclosure to the public on this, that they can accept the dead rat and have confidence in us moving forward. Now, obviously there's a whole lot of variables in that we can't, but there are certain things that we do know. One is that we've talked in this chamber for 8 years about the importance of grade separation, the importance that we will not be able to optimise the investment that we're actually putting into the CRL unless we undertake certain things. And there's a whole range that flow out of that. But grade separation is a huge one. I think the second one, and this is the most unpalatable part of this whole thing for me, is who's going to pick up the OPEX on this? Who's, you know, until we resolve the issue of ownership, what are we committing the public of Auckland to in terms of ongoing maintenance and costs associated? So that if we're going to go to the public of Auckland now and say, look, hand on heart, we have tried to factor in absolutely everything that we need to be able to do within the bounds of what we now know, and you know what we don't know, as the Mayor correctly said before. But have officers had internal discussions on those things that should be included as part of the package? Because at the end of the day, CityRail Limited is a bit like a CCO, and it's there to deliver what we are, and when I say we are, it's the government as well, what we are wanting. But the package of measures in it, the design of it, the responsibility of that largely rests with us, with this council. So I just would like your feedback on those things that you might have considered should be part of public disclosure at this point if we are to optimise the investment we are going and have already put into CityRail Limited.
Okay, in terms of the CityRail Link project, the CityRail Link Limited, they've got a very clear scope. You're quite right in that it's up to the sponsors to decide what the scope of the project is. So the scope for CityRail Limited is very specific. In terms of trust and confidence, you've heard this morning that there's been a comprehensive reforecasting exercise involving a whole bunch of the best experts in New Zealand and Australia reviewing, challenging, testing those cost assumptions. So there should be a very high degree of trust and confidence in the CityRail Link project for its given scope. In terms of those issues around ongoing operation maintenance, as you heard from the Chief Executive earlier, that's ongoing work with central government we're hoping to progress over the next 6 months. All of that remains uncertain until those discussions have been had. In terms of the wider impacts and costs and implications for the wider network. Might ask Barry to talk about some of that.
Perhaps following on from my comment earlier on in the session, it's one of these things with infrastructure that when you build it, you build a motorway, and so you built the motorway, then that suddenly puts the pressure on all the feeder roads into the motorway, and you've moved the traffic issue down the other end of the motorway, so you have to do more in the future. When this is built, there will be pressure on grade separations and so on and so forth. And I think one of the perverse things about infrastructure or this is the more successful this project is, the greater will be the pressure on future councils to resolve the consequences of greater patronage. So kind of one of these things that things are going to have to be done in the future. If this is far more successful than our wildest optimism, there will be huge pressure on future councils to deal with grade separation and all the other bits that go with that. That's kind of what infrastructure does, unfortunately. The success brings other issues.
Yes, but Barry, as one of our best performing officers, I would ask you to comment on those things that are foreseen and those things that are unforeseen. And I agree with you that with infrastructural investment, there will be unintended consequences, there will be issues that arise, but right at this time, there are things that are foreseen. And do we have an obligation to actually have greater transparency around that? Now, if we are going to the public and coming clean, if you like, on where these additional costs might fall.
In the coming years, and you're looking out past the end of this 5 years out, so you're looking at 10 years, there will be pressure and needs to do grade separation because we will end up with more trains, more passengers using it, and hopefully the drive then is less people in cars, more people using this, so you have to change the transport mode and all the other bits of infrastructure that go with that, and that will continue on for many years, I anticipate. But at the end of this, if the forecast patronage is right, there will be things that need to be done. And as I say, the greater the success, the more pressure there will be on future councils.
Barry, you were going to also comment in a little bit more detail, and I'm all for ensuring the resilience of this network, but I just need to understand and have confidence in that if we're going to go ahead with the recommendations, that what we know is that most of the trains are coming from the west, as best we have it, through the CityRail, and then they'll be heading south. So given that the resilience that we are having to factor in will involve some costs between 400 to 600 million to achieve that, can you say that that is utterly necessary?
I can't, outside of this project here, I can't speak with authority just on anything else that might be required at the end of this. I know that there are things that are required in terms of making this operational on day one, more trains, more training. There will be changes to switching in other areas. There may well need to be decisions around road crossings and so on. So there will be flow on from this. And over the next 5 years, as this project is built and constructed, consideration and will need to be given to that as forecasts for future patronage and so forth become realised.
My final questions probably are really Shane Allison, and that is, can you confirm that over the last 4 years there have been a number of unsolicited requests to purchase some of our car parks, so that we actually know that there are people wanting to purchase them now?
I can't confirm that over the last 4 years. I'm not aware of any, but there may be others that are aware of that.
Through you, Meg Off, I can't recall the last time we were delivered a cheque, but I think it was for 70 million by, I think, the tournament parking people. That's nearly 4 or 5 years ago. It's quite back in time. Precinct Properties have not made an offer, but they have made it clear they have a long-term interest in the downtown car park. I'm not aware of any others.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. What we do know is that infrastructure is going to cost us for public infrastructure, and we know if we don't put public transport in, we'll be paying the cost of massive productivity losses as the city gridlocks. So we've got more expenditure to come, and that will be addressed in the next long-term plan. But what we're looking at today are the specific costs related to this project. Right, Councillor Darby.
Well, nice segue. Thank you for the intro there in terms of the investment in public transport, and that's what I'm going to here. I just want to go to the motion that is before us as a recommendation, and that's the C, and it's about the strategy. Councillor Close explored that, and we know that it's a lot broader than most of us think. I'm aware of the 2015 strategy, and if I go to Park and Ride is inextricably linked to the provision of feeder bus services. You can't separate them. So, Shane, for you, I'm struggling to accept just the inclusion of additional investment in park and ride facilities when we know, and you write in the strategy, that feeder bus services is just as important as the provision of physical facilities. And I'm wondering if it is fairer to add to that it reads including additional investment in park and ride facilities and public transport feeder services.
I can't comment on the recommendation as such. What we see is that if you want to, I guess, increase the use of public transport, particularly from the outer parts of the region, that park and ride can be a very, very attractive way to do that, and it can be more cost effective than feeder bus services. I accept that that is not the case in every situation. And we also, there's a system-based approach which could include things that we're looking at the moment, which is first mile, last mile options, whether they be bikes, the trial that's going on in Devonport at the moment. So I'm not sure that that answers your question, but we have something like, I can't recall the exact number, between 75 and 80 million in the Regional Land Transport Plan for Park and Ride. That investment, just because of the phasing, is not due to occur until 2026, 2027, 2028. You may consider as part of the options here that that investment is brought forward rather than adding more. There's a whole number of options we could look at as part of this.
So just tell me, where did that come from? Who proposed those words, including park and ride facilities, but as I point out, not taking into account the place of those feeder services? So I want to know how that was arrived at, because that would require a variation to the Regional Land Transport Plan, I think. I just want to know why it's limited, because the parking strategy goes further than that. It does specifically refer to the importance of feeder services. I'm trying to get an understanding of how it narrowed down so much.
There's no reason in our view why it would need to be limited to just park and ride facilities. But we know that there has been considerable requests and voice given to the need for increased park and ride facilities, particularly in places like Albany, like Papakura, and there will be more need for them in the south, in places like Treasury, Pukekohe, etc.
So through the chair, it might just be worth clarifying too with the language. When we were using the language recycling that wasn't probably the right language to use, we were very much talking about taking capital out of one asset and putting into another. The feeder services would be OPEX, so absolutely we could look at it as part of the broader strategy, but I don't think we'd be proposing to take money out of car parks to feed ongoing OPEX for buses and feeder services. I think we'd fund them on their own merits by normal PT funding with NZTA.
Okay. Just another question, probably for Barry. Barry, you've given this the good value for money sweep in terms of what we're getting for our investment, there was a letter here in the agenda, and it's on page 23. Can you just explain, and I've been assured that from Sir Brian and yourself that the quality of the public realm is no less. There'll be great public buildings, the stations, etc. Can you just explain that line in the graphic there, the minus 36 in urban realm funding? What sits in behind that?
It's quite simple. Yes, I can explain it. That is funding that comes from the targeted rate. So that's funding that's already committed primarily for C1, C2, 36 million. So that's not part of this. CRLL will deliver that streetscape work, but it's funded from outside this here.
Thanks for that clarification. Good. Thanks.
Right. Look, just to give hungry councillors a chance to know where I'm going on this, it's 1:10. What I'd like to do is to get through the remainder of the questions that have been notified to me. There's 7 of those, and then we'll take lunch. Okay, thank you. 6. But I'd like to finish the questions, and then we'll come back and we'll begin the debate on the recommendations after lunch. Is everybody happy with that? Might take us, depending on how quick you are with your questions, so there's an incentive. Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
Following on from Councillor Watson's questions, was about the Office of the Auditor General. Have we, Ross, put these proposals past the Office of the Auditor General, even informally, to say that it ticks their boxes for significance or not?
No, we haven't engaged with the Office of the Auditor General on this. In terms of whether things are significant or not, we work with our internal legal team. When we go through an LTP review, in terms of requirements with legislation, the Office of the Auditor General relies heavily on our internal legal advice around that. The question that the auditors usually ask us is, what is the evidence around your assumptions? What data analysis do you have to support your assumptions? And we think here, in terms of the cost side, we've got ample evidence. We think the 50 million target for the parking strategy is a very credible number given the value of those assets. So we're quite comfortable that we wouldn't see any issues with audit.
Thank you very much. As soon as I mentioned lunch, the number on the speaking list is mysteriously reduced. Congratulations. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Just wondered if you could put up the slide that covers off the breakdown of where we find the money.
Keep your speech on while we're waiting for that, Wayne.
So, quite obviously, one of the reasons that we're doing this is because of the debt to revenue ratio. If I look at the item there, 100 million, around the flexibility of the timing, does that go to debt to revenue, or is it really just deferring a liability?
Sorry, it does go to debt to revenue. That is an extra 100 million of debt that we take on. It counts towards our ratio. But what happens is that it comes into the equation later in the period. Years 6 of the LTP, so our revenue grows over time. So every year of the LTP, the revenue number goes up.
I understand that. But isn't it a liability that we know straight off and we have to factor it in terms of debt? It's just a matter of when the payment comes due?
No, we factor it in terms of capital investment. It is when the work is done, when the cash is paid. So that's the normal practice for all of our capital expenditure. It becomes a financial liability as the work is progressed.
Okay, so following on from that, if we apply the question that Councillor Watson asked earlier, if we can increase that, then our debt to revenue is better off.
Yes, to the extent that we only have so much headroom that we're able to accommodate in those years, but to the extent that we can pay later rather than earlier, that helps.
Okay, got that. Reassessment of the valuation of the operating commitments, and that goes to the PTOM and buses. What about the operating commitments that we've got for ferries and trains? Do they fall into the same principle, or are they different?
They don't. I mean, those contracts are structured a little bit differently, and they don't have anywhere near the same sort of dollar values associated with them.
But aren't we switching the ferries over to PTOM?
Yes, but you're not talking anywhere near the magnitude of dollars.
But the principle applies. That's my question. In which case, if the principle applies, why wouldn't we add them on? And what about the trains?
That's a separate piece of analysis outside of this was us forward modelling that what you're describing there with the change to a PTOM contract. It's something we actually need to look at, but it's not necessarily going to give you an uplift because you bring in a liability and revenue at the same time when you shift to a PTOM model.
So my question is around expanding that amount to take into account ferries and trains. I don't need the answer right now, but I would like it, because for me the principle applies. The other question that I've got just goes to the parking buildings. You mentioned the revenue from the parking buildings. Have you got the valuation of the assets? Because the issue I've got there is around the return on investment, because obviously that goes to our debt to revenue ratio.
Can you just repeat the question?
Okay, so you've given us the information on the revenue from the parking buildings. As it goes to an equation around debt to revenue, the issue is around the valuation of the buildings. So what's the valuation of the buildings? Because I'm assuming that if we're flogging something off, we're not just flogging off an asset, we're also flogging off revenue, and that impacts on our debt to revenue.
Correct. So firstly, those 4 assets are on the books for $298 million for those large 4 car parks. If you were to sell them, and this is not based on any actual valuation, you'd expect that the valuation would be north of that. An acquirer would be looking at it at exactly that point, how much revenue do these car parks produce? But if you simplistically think of it like this, if we went and did a concession with Civic and sold it, for example, the concession, for, say, it was $70 million. At the moment, that asset is producing $7 million or 6.7 million of revenue. The ratio would need to be adjusted by the 6.7 times your 2.7. So you'd effectively, so I know this is quite technical, but out of the $70 million, about $20 million of it would need to go to debt reduction. The other 50 would then give you the capacity to contribute to CRL. So that's how it gets factored into the ratio, the way the rating agencies look at it. So you absolutely need to adjust your calculation for the loss of revenue.
Okay, got that. The other question I've got is for Shane Ellison and Auckland Transport. Is it desirable, in respect of looking at this strategy that we're talking about around the parking buildings, to factor in the parking requirements for carpooling, bicycles, e-bikes, electric vehicles, electric buses, taxis, mobility parking, loading zones, waste collection, pedestrianisation of Queen Street and other streets, additional bus lanes, light rail, the parking requirements for increased numbers of residents and workers in the city over a period of time?
A number of those things, the list is quite long, but a number of those things would need to be taken into consideration. Yes.
Okay, that's great. And the last question I've got just goes to future-proofing, and that is around whether the future-proofing and the budget, if you like, covers off anything for compensating businesses that are affected, either directly or indirectly. And the context to that is, I know that there are any number of businesses in the Albert Street, Victoria Street vicinity severely affected now? Anything in the budget?
The answer is no.
Okay, that's all right. And the last question, and again it might go to Shane Ellison, is there any future proofing around requirements that might go to climate change, particularly around sea level rise as it goes to this project, especially the lower part of it in Britomart?
I don't think that's a question for me.
Sorry, how's that? My apologies.
What's the future proofing? Because the tunnel, obviously, outside Britomart is very close to the water level. If we have a 1.5% increase in climate and the sea level rises by a metre, or more, how are you future proofing to ensure that you're not going to flood your tunnel?
Oh, the specifics of how that's achieved, I can't tell you, except to assure you that it is. Flooding of tunnels is a pretty serious, pretty significant part of the consideration, along with every other future life safety area. So
I'm sure the techniques are there because they do it in London with the depth of the tube, but there's a question we should have probably put to CRLL. We'd maybe handle that separately, Councillor.
And my last question just goes to the business case 2015, which I've read, and also the AT parking strategy document 2015 that I've read, particularly as it goes to the business case. Are we going to present some analysis around costing where the benefits occur? And if I refer to the business case refers to the efficiency benefits, the climate change benefits, employment, GST, income tax and the like. Are we going to be demonstrating where those benefits go? And frankly, most of them, almost all of them, go to the government. So are we going to be putting that information in black and white? That goes to the case that the Chief Executive has referred to around the negotiations with the government over the next 6 months that will no doubt go to the apportionment of capital and operation, and in my opinion, is vital.
So I think that question is, what of these benefits, obviously a lot of them are to Auckland, what benefits go to...
No, not many to Auckland.
Well, let's put it as a question so that they can answer it. What benefits go to government and how might that influence the government's share of the funding of them?
I'll do my best to answer it on my understanding, which might need to be corrected, but my understanding is the benefits are around commuter time, around greenhouse gas, around cars off roads, around all that kind of thing. It's not about tax or revenue to the government. This is about actual benefits to Auckland and Aucklanders.
Sure. My question is, the business case refers specifically to income tax, GST and the like. Those things are in the business case 2015. I am simply, and so are a whole range of things, what I am suggesting as a next step is there needs to be some apportionment around those benefits that go directly to the government, for example, meeting our climate change requirements, less accidents on the road, so on and so forth, GST, income tax, versus those benefits that go to us and ratepayers. Can that work be done?
Can I just check through you, Mayor? Are you talking about the parking strategy or the CRL business case?
I'm looking at the business case 2015, which goes through the benefits. It actually itemises them, quantifies them, but doesn't apportion them in terms of who gets the benefit.
Look, I'm happy if our officials can have a look at that and see if they can come back with an answer to the question. It's a valid question.
Sure.
I'm not sure that they've got the answer in front of it. Thank you very much for that, Councillor. Just before I take the last three questions, I've talked to officers about what the impact would be of taking out outright sale of car parks, and I'm advised that the $50 million could be relatively easily achieved through either the sale of a concession or the sale of airspace above the development as a joint venture. So on that basis, I'm happy, Councillor Casey, to take out the word outright sale with the agreement of my seconder, and so it would be alongside partnering with developers and concession arrangements. The critical thing in this is we need to demonstrate that we can get $50 million worth of value out of what we are proposing, and officers assure me that that's correct. So that's just clarify that for councillors. Councillor Greg Sayers.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just 4 fairly brief questions. First one I put to CityRail Link Limited this morning. They suggested I direct it to Auckland Council this afternoon, mainly because it feels like we're having to cough up with the money at fairly short notice, and there doesn't seem to be too many options to avoid that. So my question to them was, has the privatisation of the scheme or any other partnerships, as was kind of also alluded to by the Heart of Auckland this morning, been kind of seriously considered? And if so, what update can you give the councillors on how far that has progressed?
So I don't mind picking that. Through the chair, I think, as you know, we remain closely involved with central government officials. The program is labelled the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Workstream. My understanding most recently of where that sits is it's making its way as a proposal to Cabinet that will suggest legislative change options that would enable us, perhaps as early as next year, to consider credible alternative arrangements for funding, financing these sorts of projects. So what I would say is, yes, it's being thought about, but I'll be honest, the credibility of bringing forward a package that we could all sit behind and know it could be converted easily is not there today. But there is, reasonable indication, given the program and the focus of the government, that in another 12 months' time we could well be there, and indeed might expect to be thinking about projects of this scale, perhaps smaller ones as well, and using different structures of the sort that we've seen up in the north. Yep.
Thank you, Matthew. Just another couple, Your Worship. Thank you. Now, this question might have been answered with Councillor Newman's earlier question, but the way that I'd like to word it is, if we run into difficulties financially and we have further escalations in the costs, the contingencies that we've got in the back of the mind, and the contingencies we have resting in the back of our minds at the moment. Ross, you might have felt that you answered that fully with Councillor Newman. If you have, I can move on to the next question.
Just briefly, it's all the range of things you'd normally consider in a 10-year budget in terms of looking at rates and other revenue, looking at the cost and the timing and the extent of your capital program, looking at asset sales, and looking at the stuff Matthew's talked about in terms of longer term SPV type model. So with more time, all those options become available to deal with anything that emerges in the future.
Thank you, Ross. The next one might be for Auckland Transport, Shane, and that's as part of that car park investigation project that we'll go through to come up with some strategies around that. The fact that it could end up in almost a duopoly potentially, or there's some big players in there that could control pricing, is part of that paper that you put forward to us. Is it appropriate that the Commerce Commission or other organisations are approached to see their take on that and the viability around that?
I'm sure that's a factor that will need to be considered as part of the investigation.
And the final one, I gave a heads up to our Chief Financial Officer about this question earlier, and that's the level of comfort or the degree of certainty around the interest rates, Matthew, and if you've got any comments back through advice with Treasury on our ability to be able to keep over the next 5 years at least those rates sitting between 1.5% and 2.5%. So we do achieve that 120 million saving as indicated.
So through the chair, I cannot guarantee what will happen to global interest rates and our own interest rates, but we are very confident of the level of saving over the next 5 years that we've put up here, and that's because of the work of our Treasury team and the available hedging contracts in the market for us to fix a significant portion of our outstanding debt now at these lower levels. But interest rates will go where they will go. But in terms of the contractual cost we now have in place and our ability to put more hedging in at these significantly lower rates than where they were at when we set the LTP, makes us very confident of being able to generate 120 million over the next 5 years.
Just final, perhaps just a supplementary to that answer. In the paper, it's projected out 15 years, Matthew. I don't want to make an assumption that that was done for any particular reason, or it might have been. So we're talking a 5-year period at the moment. Was there a reason why we went out to 15, or was it just the way the data was presented?
Through the chair, if we're talking about the graph on the top of page 18, looking at you, Ross, perhaps Jason, I think that's what we call a yield curve. So what that's illustrating is where current market interest rates on instruments that range between a 1-year maturity and a 15-year maturity sit. It's not a year-on-year forecast of our interest costs, but happy to talk a little bit more offline about that.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you. Just as a supplementary to that, the 120 million savings, which is the most painless way of towards funding this project, you're basing that on conservative assumptions. You could actually make bigger savings than that. Is that what you're telling us?
We're working hard and would like to think that we can make bigger savings than that, and the team are busy as we speak.
Thank you very much. Last question before lunch, Councillor Lee.
Thank you. Before we go diving behind the couch looking for extra money to pay for this increment, we need to be satisfied that we have all the information to justify such a momentous decision. I heard what Viv Beck had to say about making business decisions and the need for detail, but I doubt actually if there's any business in the city right now that's faced with a decision of this scale. So we shouldn't be taking this for granted. So just coming back to the question of this $1 billion increment, construction costs, I have asked for a breakdown. I haven't got one. I'll be expecting a breakdown of these costs, all of them. All I can work on today is the figures in Mr. Potter's report, and also this very small table in Sir Brian's letter, which is attachment A. And I notice there's interesting differences in the details. They all come out the same figure, but there are quite interesting differences in detail. So I'd like to be satisfied about that. But the first point I want to ask, I think we can all guess what construction costs are, and presumably these are predicted costs rather than real costs. In other words, escalation of an existing contract or contracts. Can I have that assurance?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that, because they were this is in the letter. Thank you. Those estimates have come from CRLL, and they're based on what has been presented to us by Sir Brian and Sean. Were there some other costs that you're looking for, or I'm not quite sure I understand?
I'm looking for the word rigor has been thrown around the room today, I noticed, but I'm actually looking for that. So you probably don't have it with you, or you certainly haven't given it to us, but I would like to see a real breakdown of, for instance, construction costs. We heard the word of the mention of the cost of steel and the cost of cement, and obviously those cost movements would be critical. But yeah, we need a little bit of more information with all due respect. Coming down to client-side cost, this question should be easier. What is client-side cost?
We've got the wrong people here, but I'll do my best to answer again on behalf of Sean, who's not here. The client-side costs are costs associated with this from some from AT and CRL. The actual detail that we can give you the breakdown of those, which I do not have right here, and as I think Sean said, he can provide you and will provide you with a breakdown of these costs in detail.
It's interesting because we from my brief experience, unhappy experience in the Strategic Procurement Committee, we all know about the so-called inflation or the escalation of construction costs in Auckland on just about on every project you can think of. So that's something we live with. Only the government, I guess, and the council could, if they really wanted to, could confront that problem. However, it's interesting that the construction costs are predicted to increase by 13%, but the client-side costs are predicted to increase by 31%. So could we have an explanation for those differences? I take it client-side cost doesn't include the cost of cement and steel.
Can I suggest, they're valid questions, that we know the process has been gone through to help ensure the rigour of the results they've given, but I think it'd be useful for all councillors to have a breakdown of that chart on the project cost reforecast, so we knew exactly how those figures were arrived at. I don't doubt the figures, but I don't know, and you don't know apparently, how they were arrived at. So that would be useful if we could get that off CRLL and circulate it to all of councillors. Thank you.
Just one more question, if I could, Mr. Mayor, and that is, we obviously agree we need a little bit more information on costs. Now, benefit analysis, if you recall, I just want to make one point here. Throughout this report, there's a reference to 2014 figures. Up until 2017, the government, the ministers were talking about a cost envelope of 2.8 to 3.4. So Dr. Sweeney and apparently Mr. Potter have started talking about 2014. I think we need to be really, really clear about the forensics of these cost increases. But coming back to benefits, when the original business case was proposed, launched and sent to the government, there was fierce debate and criticism over its alleged benefits, agglomeration benefits and so on. And I think the Minister of Transport at the time, Mr. Joyce, made a famous comment of benefits on agglomeration benefits on steroids, or words to that effect. But that reminds us how contested the notion of benefits were by Treasury, in essence, on the original 2.4 to 2.8 project, which included the Newton station, which included a fleet of EMUs. But coming back to this PwC benefit analysis, is it unusual, given this is a Crown enterprise, is it unusual that the company itself engaged PwC? And I know there's connections between CRL Limited, or personnel connections between CRL Limited and PwC. Is it unusual for PwC to be engaged and presumably paid for by CityRail Limited rather than Treasury providing the benefit analysis of this incremental cost of the increased price of the increased project cost of the CityRail. CityRail Mark III.
Okay, I think we got the question, and let's get the answer to the question. And just to double check, the PwC report is available for all councillors that want to have a look at it. So every one of us can scrutinise that ourselves. But an answer to the question, please.
In terms of the appointment of PwC, I can't comment on that. I wasn't party to that, but I have reviewed their letter, which everyone's is available to all, and their independent advice sets out the $6.6 billion worth of benefits and their reassessment of those.
I've all due respect on the use of independent. We're in the real world here. Treasury is probably more independent than a company that's paid for by a client. So I think we should be just to be a little bit sceptical and step back on this stuff.
Yep. As you know, Councillor, CRLL is accountable both to central government agencies and to council, and I don't know the ins and outs of it. I wasn't involved with it, but I imagine that both sponsors were happy with that product.
Can I just make a point here, Mr. Mayor, with all due respect?
There's a debate coming up. We're on questions. This is the final question, and we're already at 1:40.
Just one point, not a question. You signed the sponsorship agreement.
I'm sorry, Councillor. If you want to make this point, please make it.
I want to make that clear.
No.
Point of order.
I want to make it clear that we're in question time, and that's when you ask questions. When it comes to debate, you can make whatever comment you like within reason. So thank you, councillors. If we get back at 10 past 1 to begin the debate on this issue. Thank you.